For whatever reason, when I was in seminary, my absolute favorite courses were the ethics courses. And one of my professors said that all of Christian ethics can be summed up with one question. How then shall we live? How then shall we live? Or perhaps, what then should we do? And I think it's a great question, and we can focus on each one of those words. It's kind of one of those sentences. But the word that jumps out to me is the word then, because the question isn't, how shall we live? Or what should we do? But how then shall we live? Which suggests to us that this is a response to something that has happened. Given that God has called us to love God with all our heart, our soul, our mind, and our strength, given that God has called us to love our neighbors as ourselves, how then shall we live? We think about all the things that have happened this week in this city. People that experienced great violence, great terror, tragedy. In light of the things that are happening in this world, how then shall we live? What do we do? Being a Christian is always living in response to something that God has done, something our neighbors have done, something that's happening in our lives. We're always responding. And in fact, it's almost impossible to articulate the gospel not knowing what God is doing in the world and not knowing what our neighbors are doing. And this makes being a Christian much more complicated, right? If we had like a samurai code, or if life could be followed like the rules of Monopoly, then we can ask a very simple question. What do we do? Well, I got this code here. And so I'm going to wake up in the morning and I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this. And if anybody gets in my way, I'll tell them to get out of my way because God has told me to do these things. It's much more complicated when God says, you need to listen. You need to listen to me. You need to listen to what's happening in your world, in your neighborhood, in your home. And then that's going to determine what you're going to do that day. You might get up with a plan, but that plan is going to change pretty much after you brush your teeth. That's what being a Christian is about. And we can, to be honest, when I was encountering all of these events this week, the same as all of you, I don't know, I'm sure there were some of you that said, this is too much. I'm turning off the radio, I'm turning off the TV. Too much for me this week, which is valid. For me, I was deeply moved, and I'm sure some of you were listening on CBC. There's the woman who was I believe she was a lawyer, and she was on her way to Parliament Hill, and she encountered this Corporal Cirillo when he was dying. Do you know that? Did you hear that interview? No. It was such a powerful example for me. I'll read you some of the things that she said. She said the people that were working with him, they were all just there for him. There was nothing else in the world for us, the five of us, when we were there, except for that man. And she kept saying to him, your military family loves you. Look at these people. We're all here helping you. We're all trying to do what we can for you. We all love you. This is a woman who was on her way to work or whatever she was going to do. She thought she'd take a couple pictures, and something happened. And perhaps she listened to the voice of God, although I don't know what happened to her, but I just feel like that the moment that she described was a sacred moment. Her entire day changes, her world changes, and she's there only to love in this moment of deep sorrow and tragedy. I'm thinking about the next day, there was the mosque in Alberta. Did you hear about this? Where there was spray painted with all this terrible stuff on it, perhaps in response to this. And the whole community went out and helped clean the building. And I think even more importantly, say, no, you were loved in this community and you were accepted. given tragic events that happen in the world, given great violence, how then shall you live? How will you respond to evil in the world? That is often what we are called to do. As Christians, and from the very beginning, the Christians were not called to build nations. We were living in a nation that was run by the emperor. So our gospel is built on often a response to great violence and great tragedy. Our faith is built around listening to God, listening to our neighbors, listening to our world. And it's often in those moments of response that something sacred and powerful happens. It's a very simple sermon this morning, to be honest. I encourage you to listen. Listen to the voice of God working in your life and in the world. Listen to your neighbors. How shall you live? As God has called you to love God and love your neighbor. Amen.